Europe during the Middle Ages was a land shaped by uncertainty, faith, and survival. Spanning nearly 1,000 years from the collapse of Roman authority to the threshold of the Renaissance, medieval life unfolded in a fragmented and often brutal world. Kingdoms rose and fell, borders shifted through war and marriage, and power was concentrated in the hands of nobles and the church. For the vast majority of people, life was rural, labor-intensive, and deeply vulnerable to forces beyond human control. Most medieval Europeans lived in small villages surrounded by farmland and thick forests. Homes were built from wood, mud, or rough stone, with thatched roofs and dirt floors. Clean water was scarce, hygiene was limited, and disease spread easily. Plagues, crop failures, and famine were recurring threats. A single bad harvest could doom an entire community. Life expectancy was low, and death was a constant presence. Religion offered structure and meaning in this harsh environment. Christianity dominated every stage of life, from birth to burial. Church bells marked the hours of the day, and religious festivals structured the calendar year. People believed God controlled the natural world. Rain, drought, health, and illness were all seen as divine messages. When events went wrong, it was often assumed that a moral or spiritual failure was to blame. The natural landscape itself felt alive and dangerous. Forests covered large parts of Europe and were places of mystery and fear. Wolves, bandits, and wild animals were real threats, but forests were also believed to shelter spirits and dark forces. At night, without artificial light, darkness was complete. Shadows stretched endlessly, and unfamiliar sounds stirred the imagination. Fear thrived in such conditions. This environment shaped how medieval people understood the world. With limited scientific knowledge, explanations for misfortune were often supernatural. Illness, storms, or sudden death demanded answers, and invisible forces seemed just as real as visible ones. In this world, belief was not a choice, it was a survival mechanism. Understanding medieval Europe is essential to understanding witches. Witchcraft did not emerge from fantasy alone. It grew from a society living on the edge of disaster, searching for meaning, protection, and control in a world that often offered none. The meaning of the word witch changed dramatically over the course of the Middle Ages. In early medieval Europe, the concept was not clearly defined, nor was it always associated with evil. Many individuals later labeled as witches were once known as healers, wise women, or folk practitioners. They possessed knowledge of herbs, childbirth, and traditional remedies passed down through generations. Early terms related to witchcraft often implied wisdom or skill rather than malice. These individuals played important roles in their communities, especially in rural areas where physicians were rare. People turned to them for help with illness, fertility, and protection. Their practices blended prayer, observation of nature, and tradition inherited. As Christianity strengthened its hold over Europe, attitudes began to shift. Religious authorities increasingly viewed any spiritual practice outside church control as suspicious. Magic was redefined not as a neutral skill, but as a dangerous act that challenged divine authority. The distinction between acceptable religious ritual and forbidden magic became sharper. By the late Middle Ages, the word witch was increasingly associated with wrongdoing. Accusations began to include claims of harmful magic, curses, and secret rituals. Church teachings emphasized that supernatural power could come only from God or the devil. This belief left no space for neutral magic. Any unexplained power became suspect. The transformation reached its peak in the late 15th century. Influential religious texts described witches as servants of Satan who deliberately harmed society. These writings portrayed witches as enemies of God, accused of attending secret gatherings, making pacts with demons, and undermining Christian order. The word witch became a label of fear and condemnation. Language played a powerful role in shaping reality. Once a person was called a witch, their actions, intentions, and even their identity were reinterpreted through that lens. Healing became manipulation. Knowledge became corruption. Difference became danger. The evolution of the word witch reflects broader changes in medieval society, shifts in power, fear of the unknown, and the growing authority of religious institutions. It was not just a change in definition, but a transformation in how people understood good, evil, and human agency. For centuries, European life was guided by beliefs older than Christianity. Seasonal rituals, reverence for nature, and spiritual traditions tied to land and ancestry shaped everyday practices. These beliefs did not vanish when Christianity spread. Instead, they continued quietly, woven into daily life and local customs. People relied on charms for protection, rituals for good harvests, and folk remedies for healing. These practices were practical responses to an unpredictable world. When medicine failed and prayer seemed distant, tradition filled the gap. These beliefs were not seen as rebellion, but as necessity. The Church, however, sought spiritual unity and authority. Christianity taught that truth flowed from a single divine source, interpreted by religious leaders. Over time, tolerance for alternative spiritual practices diminished. What could not be controlled or sanctioned became dangerous. This created a deep and growing tension. Folk traditions persisted, but increasingly in secrecy. Church sermons warned against superstition, linking it to sin and demonic influence. Ordinary people found themselves caught between old habits and new rules, unsure which beliefs might lead to salvation or punishment. Conflicts arose when misfortune struck. A failed harvest, a sudden illness, or an unexplained death demanded answers. When prayers failed, suspicion turned outward. Those who lived differently or practiced forbidden traditions became targets. Fear sharpened boundaries. This struggle between superstition and the Church was not merely ideological. It shaped laws, accusations, and social divisions. Authority and belief collided, and those who stood between the two were most vulnerable. Witches emerged from this tension. They represented unresolved contradictions, keepers of ancient knowledge in a world demanding religious conformity. Their existence challenged order, and in times of fear, challenge became threat.
Fear of witches grew from uncertainty and desperation. Medieval life offered few explanations for suffering. Disease appeared without warning. Crops failed without reason, and death came suddenly. In the absence of scientific understanding, people sought causes that matched the scale of their fear. Witches were believed to act in secret. They were thought to harm from the shadows using invisible forces. This made them especially terrifying. An enemy that could not be seen or easily identified felt far more dangerous than one who could be confronted openly. Many accused witches lived on the margins of society. They were often elderly, poor, widowed, or socially isolated. Their difference made them noticeable, and their vulnerability made them easy to accuse. Familiarity with herbs or unusual behavior could be interpreted as evidence of dark knowledge. Religious teachings reinforced these fears. Writings described witches as servants of evil, capable of spreading illness, destroying crops, and corrupting souls. These descriptions blended imagination with doctrine, turning fear into conviction. Once fear took hold, it spread quickly. Suspicion bred more suspicion. Accusations required no proof, only belief. A whisper could become a death sentence. Communities torn by grief or hardship found relief in assigning blame. Witches were feared not because they were proven dangerous, but because they embodied uncertainty. They stood at the edge of understanding, where knowledge ended and fear began. In a world desperate for order, that was enough to make them enemies. Long before Christianity spread across Europe, people understood the world through nature. Forests, rivers, mountains, and fields were not inert landscapes, but living forces filled with meaning and power. Pagan traditions were deeply rooted in this worldview, shaping how communities understood life, death, and the unseen. Nature was sacred, cyclical, and responsive to human behavior. Seasonal changes held great significance. The turning of the year, spring planting, summer growth, autumn harvest, and winter rest, was marked by rituals meant to ensure survival. These ceremonies honored natural spirits, fertility, and balance. Fire, water, earth, and air were seen as powerful elements, each deserving respect. Rituals often took place outdoors, in clearings, groves, or near stones believed to hold ancient power. Pagan traditions did not rely on written doctrine. Knowledge was passed orally through stories, songs, and repeated practice. Elders taught the young how to read signs in the sky, the behavior of animals, and the growth of plants. A storm was not just weather, it was a message. A failed crop was not coincidence, it was imbalance. These beliefs encouraged a close relationship with the natural world. Plants were not merely resources, but allies. Certain trees were thought to protect, certain herbs to heal, and certain locations to open pathways between worlds. Death was not an end, but a transformation, returning the body to the earth from which it came. When Christianity arrived, it did not immediately erase these traditions. Instead, pagan practices continued quietly, blending with Christian observance. Old festivals were adapted into Christian holidays, and ancient symbols survived beneath new meanings. Yet the core belief that power could exist outside God's authority became dangerous. What was once sacred began to be seen as forbidden. Practices rooted in nature were increasingly labeled as superstition or paganism, laying the groundwork for later accusations of witchcraft. In medieval communities, knowledge was survival. Among the most vital figures were herbalists, midwives, and wise women, individuals who possessed practical understanding of the body, illness, and healing. Their knowledge was not learned in universities, but earned through observation, experience, and tradition. Herbalists understood the land intimately. They knew which plants eased pain, reduced fever, or stopped bleeding. In an era without formal medicine for most people, this knowledge was invaluable. Villagers depended on these remedies for everyday survival, especially during times of plague or famine. Midwives held a particularly powerful role. Childbirth was dangerous, and many women did not survive it. Midwives guided mothers through labor, cared for newborns, and handled complications as best they could. They were present at the boundary between life and death, a position both respected and feared.
Wise women often combined healing with spiritual guidance. They offered advice, interpreted dreams, and performed protective rituals. Their presence was strongest in rural areas where priests or doctors were rare. People trusted them not only with their bodies, but with their fears. However, this authority existed outside official structures of power. These women did not answer to the church or the state. Their independence made them essential and dangerous. As religious control tightened, such autonomy became suspect. When outcomes were good, they were praised. When outcomes were tragic, blame followed. A child who died in childbirth or a sickness that worsened could quickly turn respect into accusation. Knowledge that once saved lives began to attract suspicion. These roles did not disappear overnight, but their meaning shifted. Healers became potential witches. Experience became evidence. The same hands that delivered life could, in the eyes of fear, also deliver death.
The medieval church viewed the world through a strict moral and spiritual framework. According to Christian teaching, all supernatural power came from God. Anything that did not originate from divine authority was assumed to come from evil. This belief left no room for neutral magic. Early church leaders were initially more concerned with heresy than witchcraft. However, as Christianity spread, it sought to eliminate competing belief systems. Pagan rituals, charms, and folk practices challenged the church's claim to spiritual authority. Over time, tolerance gave way to condemnation. Magic was redefined as sinful. Even practices meant to heal or protect were considered dangerous if they bypassed prayer or church ritual. The idea that ordinary people could influence events through spells or herbs threatened religious hierarchy. Sermons warned against superstition. Religious texts described magic as deception, leading souls away from God. Fear was cultivated deliberately, linking folk practices to demonic influence. The message was clear: safety lay only in obedience. As church influence grew, laws followed belief. Secular authorities aligned with religious doctrine, criminalizing magical practices. What had once been tradition became crime. This stance hardened attitudes toward anyone associated with non-Christian practices. The line between healer and heretic blurred. Accusation became easier, and defense became nearly impossible. By positioning magic as evil, the church reshaped society's fears. Witchcraft was no longer a matter of belief, it became a threat to divine order itself. Few texts shaped the fear of witches as powerfully as Malleus Maleficarum, written in the late 15th century. Meaning the hammer of witches, the book claimed to define, identify, and eliminate witchcraft. Its influence was devastating. The text described witches as servants of the devil, capable of causing disease, storms, infertility, and death. It asserted that witchcraft was widespread and that disbelief in it itself was heresy. This framing turned skepticism into guilt. One of the book's most damaging claims was that women were especially prone to witchcraft. It portrayed women as morally weak, intellectually inferior, and easily corrupted. This reinforced existing misogyny and justified the overwhelming number of female accusations. Malleus Maleficarum also outlined methods for interrogation and punishment. Confession, often obtained through torture, was treated as proof. The book removed ambiguity, replacing doubt with certainty. Though not officially church law, its ideas spread rapidly. Judges, priests, and officials treated it as authoritative. fear gained structure and violence gained justification. This text transformed witchcraft from rumor into institution. It gave fear a manual and persecution a language. From its pages flowed centuries of suffering. Those accused or later remembered as witches lived in conditions shaped by poverty, isolation, and necessity. Most resided in small village cottages or in huts on the edges of settlements, where land was cheaper and scrutiny was lighter. These dwellings were simple structures, often consisting of a single room shared by people, animals, and tools. Walls were made of wood, mud, or rough stone, and roofs were thatched with straw. Smoke from indoor fires lingered constantly, blackening ceilings and stinging eyes. Inside these homes, everyday life was tightly bound to survival. Furniture was sparse, a wooden table, stools, perhaps a chest for possessions. Bundles of dried herbs hung from beams, collected during warmer months and saved for winter use. Clay pots, knives, mortars, and pestles filled corners of the room. Light came from candles or the hearth fire, casting shadows that shifted with every movement. Those who lived farther from the village often settled near forests. These locations offered access to firewood, plants, and privacy, but also placed inhabitants outside the protection of the community. Forest huts were colder, more exposed, and more vulnerable to suspicion. Anyone who chose such isolation was seen as different, and difference easily bred fear. Animals were often kept close. Chickens, goats, or cats shared living space, especially during winter. This closeness was practical, but it also contributed to superstition. To outsiders, a solitary figure living among animals and herbs appeared unsettling. Familiarity with nature was misunderstood as communion with hidden forces. Living conditions shaped reputation. Poverty, clutter, and isolation were often interpreted as signs of moral failure or secrecy. A home filled with strange-smelling plants and tools unfamiliar to most villagers became a source of rumor. In times of fear, every ordinary living arrangements could be recast as evidence of witchcraft. These homes were places of work, refuge, and vulnerability. They sheltered knowledge passed down through generations, but they also marked their inhabitants as outsiders. In medieval society, where conformity meant safety, living on the margins carried great risk. Within medieval communities, individuals later labeled as witches often occupied complex social roles. They were not merely outsiders, but active participants in village life. As healers, midwives, or advisors, they held knowledge others lacked and authority that existed beyond official structures. Healers treated injuries, illness, and chronic pain using herbal remedies and experience. Villagers sought them out when sickness struck, especially when prayers and standard remedies failed. Their success earned gratitude, but their failures invited suspicion. Healing was expected, death was blamed. Midwives held an especially powerful and dangerous role. They assisted in childbirth, guided infants into the world, and cared for mothers afterward. Because childbirth frequently resulted in death, midwives were present at moments of extreme emotion and vulnerability. A successful birth brought praise, a tragic one left lasting resentment. Some served as advisors, offering counsel on personal matters, disputes, or fears. Their wisdom came from age and experience rather than education. People listened to them in secret, seeking guidance outside church authority. This private influence made them valuable and threatening.
These roles created a fragile balance. Communities depended on such figures, but remained wary of their independence. Respect was conditional and easily withdrawn. One accusation could erase years of service. Over time, fear transformed these roles. A healer became someone suspected of causing illness. A midwife became someone accused of harming infants. An advisor became a manipulator of fate. The very skills that sustained communities became reasons for persecution. Social roles that operated beyond official power structures were inherently unstable. In moments of crisis, society turned on those it could not fully control. Herbalism was a cornerstone of medieval healing. Knowledge of plants, what to gather, when to harvest, and how to prepare, was developed through generations of observation. Roots, leaves, flowers, and bark were transformed into salves for wounds, teas for fever, and tinctures for pain. Preparation required patience and precision. Plants were dried, crushed, boiled, or soaked. Each step mattered. Dosage was learned through experience, not written instruction. Mistakes could be dangerous, adding to fear surrounding the practice. Many remedies worked. Modern science confirms the medicinal properties of numerous plants used in medieval times. However, when treatments failed, there was little understanding of why. Failure often led to suspicion of intent rather than limitation. Herbalism took place outside formal medicine, which was inaccessible to most people. This independence bred mistrust. Potions and mixtures looked mysterious, especially to those unfamiliar with their purpose. The line between medicine and poison appeared thin. As fear grew, herbalism was reinterpreted. Ingredients once seen as healing were recast as tools of harm. Knowledge itself became suspect. The more skilled a practitioner, the more dangerous they appeared. Herbalism, once essential, became one of the strongest foundations for accusations of witchcraft. Animals played an important role in medieval life, but those associated with suspected witches carried special meaning. Cats, owls, toads, and other creatures were believed to possess hidden qualities. Their nocturnal habits, silence, or unusual appearance fueled superstition. Close relationships with animals were common for those living alone. Cats kept pests away. Birds and small animals shared space for warmth. However, observers interpreted this closeness as unnatural. Folklore claimed witches used animals as familiars, spirits in animal form that aided them. These creatures were believed to spy, curse, or deliver messages. Such beliefs transformed ordinary animals into symbols of evil. Black cats became especially feared, associated with darkness and secrecy. Owls were linked to death and omens. Toads were seen as poisonous and corrupt. Once an animal was feared, its human companion was condemned. Animals became extensions of accusation. Their presence was treated as proof of hidden power. Innocent companionship was reimagined as conspiracy. In this way, fear spread beyond individuals, infecting every aspect of their lives.
Relationships between suspected witches and their communities were unstable and conditional. Respect existed, but it was fragile. Trust could last years and collapse overnight. Villagers relied on healers and midwives, but watched them closely. Any conflict, disagreement, or perceived slight could ignite suspicion. Rumors spread quietly at first, then openly. Social isolation followed accusation. Neighbors avoided contact. Whispers replaced conversation. Fear turned familiarity into threat. Once shunned, survival became difficult. Without community support, individuals faced hunger, exposure, and danger. Isolation reinforced accusations, creating a cycle nearly impossible to escape. Communities defined themselves by exclusion. By casting out the feared, they reaffirmed belonging and order. The accused bore the cost. These strained relationships reveal the true tragedy of medieval witchcraft, not monsters hiding among people, but people destroyed by fear, suspicion, and silence. In medieval Europe, magic was not a single concept, but a spectrum of beliefs and practices. At one end stood magic intended to heal, protect, and restore balance. At the other stood magic believed to harm, curse, or destroy. The distinction between the two was often unclear, shaped more by outcome and fear than by intention. Healing magic was closely tied to everyday survival. People sought relief from pain, illness, infertility, and misfortune. When prayer and herbal remedies failed, magical practices offered hope. Charms were spoken to protect livestock, words were whispered over the sick, and objects were blessed to ward off evil. These actions were seen as extensions of care, not rebellion against divine will. However, the same methods could be interpreted differently when circumstances changed. If a person recovered, the healer was praised. If suffering continued, suspicion arose. Magic became dangerous when it appeared to interfere with God's plan. The idea that humans could manipulate unseen forces raised deep anxiety. Harmful magic, often called maleficium, was believed to cause disease, death, infertility, and disaster. It was thought to be deliberate and malicious. Unlike healing magic, which sought restoration, harmful magic was believed to thrive on revenge, jealousy, or hatred. Accusations of maleficium frequently emerged after personal conflicts or communal crises. The boundary between healing and harm was fragile. A salve that cured one person might worsen another's condition. A spoken charm could be remembered as a blessing or later reinterpreted as a curse. Memory itself became unreliable under fear. Over time, authorities increasingly denied the possibility of benevolent magic. All magic not sanctioned by the Church was treated as harmful. This shift erased nuance and transformed healers into threats. Intent no longer mattered. Association was enough. Magic for healing did not disappear, but it retreated into secrecy. What had once been shared openly became hidden. This secrecy, in turn, reinforced fear. The more invisible a practice became, the more dangerous it seemed. Rituals formed the structure of medieval magical practice. They were repetitive, symbolic actions designed to create order in a chaotic world. Every gesture, word, and object carried meaning. Rituals offered control where none seemed possible. Symbols played a central role. Circles represented protection and completeness. Knots symbolized binding and containment. Written marks, often mistaken for runes or sigils, were used to focus intention. These symbols were drawn on parchment, carved into wood, or traced in soil. Tools were simple but significant. Candles marked transitions between light and darkness. Knives and staffs were extensions of the hand, not weapons but instruments of focus. Herbs were chosen for their properties and associations. Salt, water, and ash appeared frequently, each representing purification, life, or transformation. Rituals were often domestic or natural. A hearth, a table, or a clearing could become sacred through use. There was no formal temple, only familiarity and repetition. The ordinary became powerful through intention. These practices were deeply misunderstood. Outsiders saw patterns without context and objects without explanation. What was meaningful to the practitioner appeared ominous to observers. Secrecy magnified this misunderstanding. As fear spread, rituals were reinterpreted as signs of allegiance to dark forces. Symbols were labeled demonic. Tools became evidence. Even common household objects could be transformed into proof of guilt. The meaning of ritual was not fixed. It depended on who told the story. In times of fear, interpretation favored accusation.
Medieval people believed the heavens influenced life on Earth. Astrology was not fringe knowledge, but a respected system used by scholars, physicians, and rulers. The movement of stars and planets was thought to shape personality, fate, and health. Divination sought insight into the unknown. Dreams, visions, and signs were interpreted as messages. Techniques varied widely, casting lots, reading patterns in water, or observing animal behavior. These practices offered guidance in times of uncertainty. The moon held particular importance. Its phases governed planting, healing, and ritual timing. The full moon was associated with heightened power, while the new moon symbolized beginnings. Lunar cycles shaped both agricultural and spiritual calendars. While astrology and divination were once accepted, their association with witchcraft grew over time. The Church increasingly condemned attempts to predict or alter the future. Knowledge of the heavens became suspect. Divination was reinterpreted as arrogance, a challenge to divine will. The desire to know fate was seen as sinful. Those who practiced such arts risked being labeled dangerous. Yet belief in cosmic influence never vanished. Even those who condemned astrology consulted it secretly. This contradiction fueled fear and hypocrisy. What had once been a way to understand the universe became, in the eyes of authority, evidence of forbidden knowledge. Folk stories shaped how people imagined witches. These stories were passed orally, changing with each telling. They mixed fear, fantasy, and fragments of truth. Broomsticks became symbols of flight, believed to carry witches through the night. Shape-shifting stories described witches turning into animals to escape detection or cause harm. Such tales blurred the boundary between human and beast. Secret gatherings were said to occur in remote places, where witches met to conspire against society. These gatherings were described as chaotic and immoral, reinforcing the idea of witches as enemies of order. These stories served social purposes. They explained misfortune, reinforced norms, and gave shape to fear. They were not meant to be questioned. As authorities adopted these tales, they became legal truth. Confessions repeated stories learned in childhood. Fear fed itself. Witch hysteria did not erupt suddenly. It grew slowly from fear, instability, and shifting power. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was a continent under immense strain. Repeated outbreaks of plague devastated populations, famine weakened communities, and prolonged wars disrupted social order. Entire villages vanished, and survivors searched desperately for reasons behind their suffering. As crises multiplied, anxiety hardened into suspicion. Misfortune was no longer seen as random, but as intentional. If disaster had a cause, then someone must be responsible. This belief created fertile ground for hysteria. Fear spread through rumor, sermon, and storytelling, magnifying isolated accusations into widespread panic. Religious authority played a crucial role.
church teachings increasingly framed the world as a battleground between God and the devil. Evil was no longer abstract, it was active and organized. The idea that witches formed secret networks working against Christian society took hold. This transformed isolated folk beliefs into a perceived existential threat. Secular authorities joined this fear. Local leaders, judges, and rulers faced pressure to demonstrate control during chaotic times. Pursuing witches became a way to assert power, restore order, and reassure frightened populations. Trials were not only acts of belief, but acts of governance. Hysteria spread unevenly. Some regions experienced intense waves of accusations, while others remained relatively untouched. Once fear ignited in one area, it often spread to neighboring regions, carried by stories, officials, and shared religious texts. By the 15th century, witch hysteria had become self-sustaining. Accusations fed more accusations. Each trial validated the belief that witches were everywhere. Fear became proof. Doubt was treated as weakness or complicity. The rise of witch hysteria reveals a society unraveling under pressure. When traditional explanations failed, fear filled the void. Witchcraft became the language through which suffering was understood and controlled. At the heart of most witch accusations lay the charge of maleficum, the deliberate use of magic to cause harm. This harm could take many forms: illness, death, crop failure, infertility, or sudden misfortune. Unlike accidental wrongdoing, maleficum implied intent. The accused was believed to act with purpose and malice. Accusations often arose from everyday conflicts: a quarrel between neighbors, a refusal to give charity, or long-standing resentment could quickly escalate into suspicion. If tragedy followed, memory reshaped the past. A harsh word became a curse. A glance became a threat. Over time, accusations expanded beyond harm alone. Witches were increasingly believed to enter into pacts with the devil. According to this belief, witches gained supernatural power in exchange for loyalty to evil. This transformed witchcraft from a social crime into a spiritual one. Confessions often included vivid descriptions of these pacts. The devil was said to appear in human or animal form, offering power, wealth, or revenge. Such stories followed familiar patterns, shaped by religious teaching rather than personal experience. Once accused, individuals faced impossible odds. Denial was interpreted as deception. Admission confirmed guilt. Testimony from neighbors, even based on rumor, carried weight. Evidence was not required. Belief was sufficient. Accusations were contagious. One confession often named others, whether under pressure or fear. Entire communities could be drawn into cycles of suspicion. Trust collapsed as neighbors turned against one another. These accusations reveal how belief can overpower reason. In a society governed by fear, accusation became a weapon, and survival depended on conformity rather than truth. Witch trials followed procedures shaped by both religious doctrine and legal custom. While methods varied by region, a common pattern emerged. Accusation led to arrest. Arrest led to interrogation. Interrogation sought confession above all else. Confession was considered the highest form of proof. However, witches were believed to lie by nature, protected by the devil. This belief justified coercion. Torture was used not as punishment, but as a means of extracting truth. Interrogations could last days or weeks. Physical pain was combined with psychological pressure. Prisoners were isolated, deprived of sleep, and repeatedly questioned. Each refusal to confess was taken as further evidence of guilt. Trials lacked safeguards. The accused often had no legal representation. Witnesses could remain anonymous. Hearsay was accepted. The presumption of innocence did not apply. From the moment of accusation, guilt was assumed. Once a confession was obtained, it was read aloud publicly. Even if retracted later, it remained valid. The process was designed to confirm belief, not investigate facts. These procedures destroyed not only individuals, but entire communities. Fear of accusations silenced dissent. Justice became performance, reinforcing authority through spectacle. The trial system turned belief into law, and law into terror. One of the most famous figures associated with accusations of witchcraft is Joan of Arc. A young peasant woman who claimed divine visions, she led French forces during the 100 Years' War. Her success threatened both political and religious authority. Captured by enemies, Joan was put on trial for heresy. While not explicitly accused as a witch in the modern sense, her visions, clothing, and refusal to submit to church authority were framed as demonic deception. Her execution demonstrated how fear of spiritual independence could override heroism. Beyond Joan, countless lesser-known trials unfolded across Europe. In towns and villages, ordinary people were accused, tried, and executed. Some regions experienced mass trials, where dozens were condemned at once. Records from these trials reveal patterns: repeated accusations, similar confessions, and identical descriptions of devil worship. These similarities show how belief shaped testimony. Each case reinforced the next. Executions validated fear. Fear justified further trials. The process fed on itself, leaving devastation in its wake. These stories are not isolated tragedies. Together, they form a history of institutionalized fear.
Women made up the majority of those accused of witchcraft. This was not coincidence, but the result of deeply rooted social structures. Medieval society was patriarchal, limiting women's power while holding them responsible for morality and domestic stability. Women occupied roles closely tied to birth, illness, and death. As midwives and healers, they were present at moments of high risk. When outcomes were tragic, blame followed. Older women were especially vulnerable. Widowhood, poverty, and isolation removed social protection. Without male defenders, they stood exposed to accusation. Religious teachings reinforced these dynamics. Women were portrayed as morally weaker and more susceptible to temptation. These ideas justified suspicion and punishment. Accusing women of witchcraft served social control. It punished independence, reinforced obedience, and maintained hierarchy. Witch trials reveal not only fear of magic, but fear of women who lived beyond prescribed roles. Punishment for those convicted of witchcraft in medieval Europe was severe and often final. Once guilt was established, frequently through confession rather than evidence, the sentence reflected the belief that witchcraft was not merely a crime against individuals, but a threat to the entire moral and spiritual order. Execution was the most common punishment. Methods varied by region and time, but burning at the stake became the most infamous.
Fire was believed to purify and destroy evil completely. Public executions served as warnings, reinforcing fear and obedience within the community. Crowds gathered not only to witness justice, but to reassure themselves that the danger had been removed. Imprisonment was another form of punishment, though medieval prisons were harsh and unforgiving. Cells were dark, damp, and overcrowded. Food was scarce, disease common, and survival uncertain. Many accused witches died in prison before trial or execution, their fate sealed by neglect rather than verdict. Banishment was sometimes chosen as an alternative, especially when evidence was weak or authorities hesitated to execute. Those banished were expelled from their communities, stripped of protection and identity. Without family, land, or support, survival became extremely difficult. Banishment often led to poverty, starvation, or death. Punishments extended beyond the individual. Families of the accused were stigmatized, property was confiscated, and reputations destroyed. Children of accused witches were shunned or orphaned. The damage rippled outward, reshaping entire communities. Justice in witch trials was not about rehabilitation or truth, it was about elimination. The goal was to remove perceived corruption and restore order. Mercy was rare, as fear demanded certainty. These punishments reveal the depth of terror that governed medieval society. The violence was not random, it was systematic, driven by belief and authority. In this system, punishment became a ritual of reassurance, convincing society that evil could be identified, judged, and destroyed.
Despite overwhelming odds, some accused witches attempted to survive through caution, secrecy, and adaptation. Survival often depended on anticipating suspicion before it turned into accusation. Those familiar with local fears learned to modify their behavior, hiding knowledge that might provoke mistrust. Many abandoned visible practices associated with healing or folk belief. Herbs were concealed or discarded. Charms were destroyed. Knowledge once shared openly was kept private or passed only to trusted individuals. Silence became a form of protection. Some sought safety through conformity. They attended church regularly, avoided disputes, and displayed exaggerated obedience to authority. Religious devotion became armor against suspicion. Public prayer was used to counter private rumor. Flight was another strategy, though dangerous. Leaving a village meant abandoning home, livelihood, and identity. Travelers without references were vulnerable to arrest elsewhere, yet for some, movement offered the only chance of survival. Others relied on community allies. A respected neighbor, family member, or local official could delay or prevent accusation. Social ties mattered. Those with strong connections stood a better chance than the isolated. Confession, paradoxically, was sometimes used strategically. In rare cases, partial admission followed by repentance led to lighter punishment. This tactic was risky, as confession often spiraled into execution. Survival was not heroic or dramatic. It was cautious, fearful, and uncertain. Every choice carried danger. Even those who avoided punishment lived under constant threat. These strategies highlight the resilience of those targeted by witch hysteria. Survival required awareness, adaptability, and luck. For every story of endurance, countless others ended in silence. Though rare, some individuals accused of witchcraft survived. Their stories are fragmented, preserved through legal records, local accounts, or absence rather than presence. Survival did not always mean freedom, it often meant disappearance.
Some were acquitted due to lack of evidence or intervention by authorities skeptical of hysteria. These cases were exceptions, not the rule. Even acquitted individuals rarely returned to normal life. Suspicion lingered and trust was broken. Others escaped by leaving their communities before formal accusation. A rumor overheard, a warning from a neighbor, or sudden hostility could signal danger. Departure under cover of night saved lives, but erased histories. There were also cases where trials collapsed due to political change or public doubt. When accusations grew too extreme, they sometimes undermined themselves. Authorities occasionally halted proceedings, recognizing the damage caused. Survivors often lived anonymously afterwards. They avoided attention, changed names, and severed ties. Survival required invisibility. These stories matter because they challenge the idea that witch hysteria was inevitable. They show that fear could be resisted, even if rarely. They remind us that behind statistics were individuals who fought, fled, or endured. The history of witchcraft is dominated by loss, but survival, however fragile, reveals the cracks in a system built on fear. The image of the witch that survives today is largely a creation of myth rather than history. Over centuries, stories transformed real people into symbols of fear, exaggerating their actions and distorting their lives. These myths did not emerge randomly. They grew from collective anxiety, religious doctrine, and the human need to explain suffering. In medieval Europe, myths served as tools for understanding the unknown. When illness struck without warning or storms destroyed crops, stories provided structure to chaos. Witches became convenient explanations, figures believed to operate behind the scenes, deliberately causing harm. Over time, repeated stories hardened into belief. These myths painted witches as secretive and malevolent. They were said to meet at night, worship dark forces, and plot against society. Such narratives removed witches from ordinary humanity, portraying them as fundamentally different. Once this separation occurred, empathy disappeared. Religious teachings reinforced these myths. Sermons and texts repeated tales of witches serving evil powers, spreading disease, and corrupting souls. These ideas entered popular imagination, blending with older folk fears. Each retelling added detail, certainty, and horror. Myths also simplified complexity. Instead of acknowledging natural causes or social conflict, stories assigned blame to individuals. This made fear manageable. Evil could be named, identified, and punished. Over generations, these myths became visual and cultural shorthand. A witch no longer needed evidence to be feared. The image alone, isolated, strange, knowledgeable, was enough. The power of myth lies in repetition. When stories are told often enough, they feel true. Medieval society did not distinguish sharply between story and reality. Belief shaped action, and action reinforced belief. Understanding how myths shaped perception reveals that witchcraft hysteria was as much a product of imagination as of law. The danger was not magic itself, but the stories told about it. Historical records of witchcraft often stand in stark contrast to the folklore that surrounds them. Court documents, testimonies, and local records describe ordinary people, neighbors, widows, healers, caught in extraordinary circumstances. Folklore, by contrast, turns these individuals into fantastical beings with supernatural abilities. In legal records, accusations are often vague. Harm is implied rather than proven. Confessions follow familiar patterns, suggesting they were shaped by expectation rather than experience. The accused repeat stories they already know, drawn from sermons and popular tales. Folklore, however, presents witches as powerful and deliberate agents of chaos. They fly through the air, transform into animals, and command dark forces. These stories ignore the poverty, fear, and coercion evident in historical accounts. The gap between record and legend reveals how fear reshapes memory. Folklore thrives on drama, while history records suffering. Over time, legend replaces nuance. Many famous elements of witch lore, broomstick flight, cauldrons, mass gatherings, rarely appear in early records. They become common only after repeated storytelling. Once embedded in culture, these elements influence future accusations, creating a cycle where folklore informs testimony. Historical accounts show that most accused witches lacked power. They were not feared leaders of secret cults, but vulnerable individuals. Folklore reverses this, granting them imagined strength and intent. Comparing these sources exposes the mechanics of hysteria. Stories created expectations. Expectations shaped interrogations. Interrogations produced confessions that confirmed stories. This cycle blurred the line between fact and fiction. What people believed became what they saw. Folklore did not merely reflect belief, it created it. Stereotypes about witches persist because they are simple, dramatic, and memorable. The crooked old woman, the evil spellcaster, the enemy of society, these images endure despite lacking historical foundation. Most accused witches did not match these stereotypes. They were often integrated into their communities, known and familiar. Many were mothers, widows, or workers. Their lives were shaped by hardship, not malice. The stereotype of inherent evil ignores the role of circumstance. Accusations followed misfortune, not behavior. A person became dangerous only after something went wrong. The idea that witches were uniformly female obscures broader patterns. While women were targeted more often, men were also accused. Gender bias influenced who was suspected, but fear drove accusation. Stereotypes also erase coercion. Confessions are often taken as truth, ignoring the conditions under which they were obtained. Pain, fear, and isolation shaped testimony. What appears as admission is often survival. Debunking these stereotypes restores humanity to the accused. It reveals systems of power rather than supernatural threat. It shifts focus from imagined evil to real injustice. The endurance of these stereotypes reminds us that myths are resilient. They simplify history and make fear entertaining. Challenging them requires confronting uncomfortable truths about society, authority, and belief. To understand medieval witches accurately is not to romanticize them, but to recognize how easily fear turns neighbors into monsters and stories into weapons. Witchcraft has long occupied a powerful place in European literature, art, and theater. From the Middle Ages onward, creative expression did not merely reflect beliefs about witches, it actively shaped them. Writers and artists transformed fear into imagery, giving abstract anxieties concrete form. In medieval literature, witches often appeared as symbols rather than individuals. They represented chaos, temptation, or rebellion against divine order. Religious texts portrayed them as servants of evil, while folk tales cast them as figures of warning. These stories were not meant to explore character or motive, but to reinforce moral boundaries. Visual art followed similar patterns. Medieval illustrations depicted witches with distorted features, emphasizing otherness. They were often shown alongside demons, animals, or dark landscapes. Such imagery reinforced the idea that witches existed outside human society. Art became a language of fear, accessible even to those who could not read. Theater amplified these portrayals. public performances relied on exaggerated characters and clear moral divisions. Witches appeared as villains, tricksters, or corrupters. Their presence heightened drama and reinforced lessons about obedience and faith. Audiences absorbed these portrayals emotionally, not critically. As time passed, Renaissance and early modern writers expanded these depictions. Witches became more complex, but no less symbolic. They embodied forbidden knowledge, female power, and the danger of ambition. Literature preserved and refined stereotypes, ensuring their survival across generations. These creative works outlasted the historical witch trials themselves. Even as legal persecution declined, artistic portrayals kept the image of the witch alive. Art and literature froze witches in mythic form, separating them further from their historical origins. By shaping imagination, creative expression ensured that witches would remain cultural figures long after real accusations faded. The witch became less a person and more an idea, one that could be reshaped endlessly to reflect society's fears and desires. Long before witches became figures of terror, many traditions later associated with witchcraft were rooted in seasonal celebration. Festivals such as Samhain and Walpurgis Night marked transitions in the natural world, honoring cycles of life, death, and renewal. Samhain, celebrated at the end of the harvest season, signaled the beginning of winter. It was believed to be a time when the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. Ancestors were honored and protective rituals were performed. Fire played a central role, symbolizing warmth and protection against darkness. Walpurgis Night, celebrated in spring, marked the turning of the seasons toward growth and fertility. Bonfires, music, and communal gatherings defined the celebration. It was a time of release, renewal, and joy. As Christianity spread, these festivals were reinterpreted. What had once been celebration became suspicion. Gatherings at night, fires on hilltops, and ritual behavior were reframed as signs of witchcraft. Joy became transgression. Authorities claimed that witches gathered during these festivals to worship dark forces. The original meaning of the celebrations was erased, replaced with fear-driven narratives. Traditions survived, but their interpretations shifted dramatically. Despite this transformation, the core themes endured. Seasonal change, communal gathering, and connection to nature remained central. Over time, elements of these festivals merged with Christian holidays, further obscuring their origins. The association of these celebrations with witchcraft reveals how culture can be redefined through power. Traditions once rooted in survival and unity became symbols of danger. Memory was reshaped to serve fear. Yet, even under suspicion, these festivals persisted. Their endurance speaks to the resilience of human connection to nature and time. The image of the medieval witch continues to influence modern media. Films, novels, television, and popular culture draw heavily from historical myths rather than historical reality. The witch has become a flexible symbol, capable of representing fear, empowerment, rebellion, or mystery. Modern portrayals often borrow medieval elements, pointed hats, spells, secret gatherings, and ancient texts. These images persist because they are visually striking and culturally familiar. They simplify complex history into recognizable symbols. In some narratives, witches remain villains, dangerous figures who threaten order. In others, they are reimagined as misunderstood outsiders or empowered women reclaiming suppressed knowledge. Both interpretations trace their roots to medieval stereotypes. The persistence of these images demonstrates the lasting power of myth.
Media does not simply retell history, it reshapes it to fit contemporary values. Medieval fear becomes modern fantasy. However, this transformation also creates distance from historical truth. Real people who suffered during witch hunts are replaced by fictional characters. Suffering becomes entertainment, and injustice becomes aesthetic. At the same time, modern reinterpretations can challenge old narratives. By revisiting witchcraft through new lenses, media sometimes exposes the injustice behind the myth. The witch becomes a symbol of resistance rather than threat. The medieval witch lives on not as history, but as cultural memory. This memory is fluid, shaped by each generation. Understanding its origins allows us to see how fear becomes story, and how story becomes identity. The history of medieval witchcraft is, at its core, a history of fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of loss, fear of forces that could not be controlled or understood. In a world shaped by disease, famine, and sudden death, fear was a constant companion. It shaped belief, behavior, and judgment. Superstition emerged where knowledge was limited. Without scientific explanations, people turned to stories, symbols, and invisible forces to make sense of suffering. These beliefs were not irrational within their context. They were attempts to impose order on chaos. When prayers failed and remedies fell short, superstition filled the gap. Power determined which fears mattered. Religious and political authorities defined what was acceptable belief and what was forbidden. By labeling certain practices as witchcraft, they drew boundaries between order and disorder, obedience and rebellion. Fear became a tool of control. Those accused of witchcraft were rarely powerful. They were often the poor, the isolated, the different, yet they were described as immensely dangerous. This contradiction reveals how fear exaggerates threat. Power does not fear equals, it fears unpredictability. Witch trials reinforced authority. Each accusation demonstrated the reach of law and faith. Each punishment served as a warning. Fear flowed downward while power remained untouched. Superstition alone did not cause witch hunts. It was the combination of belief and authority that turned fear into violence. When institutions validated fear, it became unstoppable. Looking back, the terror of witchcraft appears unfounded, yet the mechanisms behind it are familiar. Fear still shapes decisions. Superstition still fills gaps in understanding. Power still determines whose fears are acted upon. The story of medieval witches reminds us that fear is most dangerous when it is shared, reinforced, and sanctioned. When fear becomes law, humanity becomes expendable. The persecution of witches is not only a historical tragedy, it is a warning. It shows how societies treat those who live at the edges, socially, economically, or culturally. The accused were rarely strangers. They were neighbors, healers, caregivers, and elders. What set them apart was vulnerability. Marginalization creates exposure. Those without protection are easier to blame. Poverty, gender, age, and isolation combined to mark certain individuals as expendable. Once labeled, they were stripped of voice and credibility. These patterns repeat across history. Groups defined as different are often portrayed as dangerous. Their practices are misunderstood, their identities reduced to stereotypes. Fear simplifies complexity, turning people into symbols. Understanding this history requires empathy rather than distance. Medieval societies did not see themselves as cruel. They believed they were acting for protection and justice. This is what makes the lesson uncomfortable. Harm does not require malice, only certainty. Modern societies possess more knowledge, but fear still influences judgment. Scapegoating persists, especially in times of crisis. The targets change, but the process remains familiar. Remembering witches as victims rather than villains challenges inherited narratives. It restores individuality to those erased by accusation. It also forces reflection on how easily societies justify exclusion. The lesson is not that the past was ignorant and the present enlightened. The lesson is that fear thrives wherever understanding fails. Awareness is not automatic, it must be cultivated. By examining the history of witchcraft, we confront the cost of silence, conformity, and unquestioned authority. The past offers no comfort, but it offers clarity. The forests, villages, and fires of medieval Europe have faded, but their stories remain. The witch, once feared as an enemy of society, now stands as a symbol of how easily fear reshapes truth. Those accused left few records of their own. Their voices were drowned by accusation and erased by punishment. What survives are fragments, testimonies shaped by coercion, stories shaped by fear, and myths shaped by imagination. Yet within these fragments lies a deeper truth. Witchcraft was never about magic alone. It was about power deciding who belonged and who did not. It was about fear demanding certainty in an uncertain world. The question that lingers is not whether witches were real, but why belief in them became so powerful. What needs did that belief serve? What fears did it soothe? What order did it protect? History does not repeat itself exactly, but it echoes. Whenever societies face uncertainty, the temptation to blame the unfamiliar returns. The language changes, but the structure remains. The story of medieval witches asks us to look inward. How do we respond to fear? Who do we trust to define danger? Whose voices are ignored when certainty takes precedence over compassion? There is no final answer, only responsibility. To remember is to resist simplification. To understand is to challenge fear. The witch, once a figure of terror, now stands as a reminder, not of evil, but of what happens when fear is given authority and humanity is denied.